Hello everyone. Today I will be covering the Tier 9 Royal Navy cruiser, the Neptune. Now, I actually covered this game last Thursday on Tech Tree Thursday because it was the ship my subs voted for me to cover, or the line they voted to cover. And this is a pretty good game example because the enemy has 2 Missouris, 2 Des Moines and a Buffalo, which means of course 5 radars. They also have a gearing from Wargaming Pay to Win, Masero, which is a competitive player, so they have a very experienced gearing player. And they have 5 battleships and, as I mentioned, of course 5 radars. And to add insult to injury, the map is Mountain Range, which is probably one of the most unfriendly cruiser maps out there because there is practically no real cover to make use of, there is no real islands to park behind. It's very hard to find any sort of consistent cover on this map. Second of all, it's standard battle, so there's no capture points that I can play around, no DDs I can ambush and capture points. The DDs might go anywhere, and I have no real guarantees. So in terms of an example gameplay, this is probably the kind of the worst possible Neptune situation you could be in. Now, the Neptune is considered something, or I at least consider it, I think it's kind of universally considered, something of a speed bump. It's quite common that the Tier 9 ships are pretty questionable in World of Warships. Usually Tier 8s tend to be fairly solid, then you get to Tier 9 and it can be a nasty experience. For example, Friedrich Grosse, Ibuki, the likes of those. But then there are exceptions, like Fletcher, for example. Anyway, the Neptune has 44.9k health, which is pretty okay in compared to the other Tier 9 cruisers. The issue, of course, that you have is that unlike the previous Royal Navy, the Fijis and the Edinburghs that you have been enjoying so far, your citadel is no longer waterline. Your citadel is suddenly massive. It starts in front of the first turret and it extends all the way behind the last turret, and in the middle of the ship where the boilers are, it extends significantly above the waterline. Calling it a floating citadel is not exactly an understatement in any way. On the other hand, the concealment also suffers some penalties, whereas the Edinburghs and could easily go way below 9, I think something like below 9.5 km concealment. You got very good concealment on the Edinburgh. You actually have an above 10 km concealment at I think 10.1 on the Neptune, and then on the Minotaur again, once you drop to like 9.3 or something. Ultimately though, when it comes to concealment, you are the big loser, and it's more than just normal spotting. You also have a significant smoke penalty, which you don't have in the Edinburgh or the Minotaur, or even the earlier Royal Navy cruisers. Your smoke firing penalty is actually 6.6 kilometers, which is massive. It's very punishing as well, because if a destroyer, I mentioned they have a really good destroyer player, that's why I have to be very careful. If the destroyer can park, let's say 6.5 kilometers outside my smoke, and if I shoot, my smoke firing penalty will render me detected. So he can sit outside my smoke and keep me spotted, and if I push out of my smoke I can't even see him. So he can counter me completely. So there's and of course then there's the radars that also cover me very heavily, so there's a lot of things that can work against me in this game. Now, what I am doing is, of course, they are pushing this flank, and you might notice that my target selection, my priorities this game is to start stripping away the radars. That should always be one of your main priorities. DDs and radars, that's what you want to be killing, because those are the things that counter you the hardest. In this case, I smoked up earlier to shoot the Des Moines, do as much damage to him as possible, and now I'm smoking up to get punishment on the Missouri. Note that you have to keep in mind that you need to stay outside of the radar ranges. You do not allow them to get inside your radar range. Another thing you might note is you probably want to be angling in the smoke as much as possible. I'm angling against the Missouri behind me. I'm giving probably a bit too much broadside to this guy, but then again I also want to be dealing as much damage to him as possible. So you got to remember the blind fire opportunity is there. He's getting a bit too close for my comfort, so I'm already starting to move. Even though I have a good minute of smoke left, I started to move because I was afraid that if he would reach my radar range, I could have instantly gotten deleted. And that's something you need to keep in mind at all times in the Neptune is, yes, you have a lot of health, yes, you have your super heals, but you are one of the most easily one-shottable ships in the entire game. That is no joke. It is so easy for anything from basically tier 7 to tier 10 to one-shot you. So you have to be very careful. There's a ship not really paying any attention here. He's ramming into me full speed. I'm using my horn to try to, like, inform him. He really doesn't seem to be noticing. he's not paying attention. I think he's sitting there zoomed in. I gave him some question marks in chat, and I asked him if he's drunk, because he's really not paying attention at all. Luckily though, we do manage to get one of the Missouris down and the Des Moines down. So that is 2 radars that we managed to chip off. But that kind of thing that happened with that Salem just charging into me, it happens quite a lot. It happens a surprising amount. Usually it's battleships, because battleships love sailing in straight lines while sitting zoomed in, and then they just ram you out of your smoke. So you need to keep a bit of a awareness of what your friendly ships are doing, so you can dodge basically incoming friendly rams. Still though, in terms of early game start, this was an excellent start. We've done about 80k damage, not too impressive, but more importantly, we managed to chip away 3 of the radars, and one of the enemy DDs has also died. So that's a lot of the threats gone, but there's still, of course, this Des Moines in the middle, and I have to be very careful. You do not want to pick a fight here. Like, it would be tempting to open up on him, but first of all, if we look at the minimap, we can see last known position, there's a Kurfürst somewhere in the middle. If you look at the minimap, you can see that there's a faded out Kurfürst. You should enable that, by the way. So the risk is here. I would love to deal damage to this Des Moines, but what if I start shooting and there's actually a Kurfürst there with my free broadside, and it will just blap me? And even more scary, I just got RPF located. Now, I mentioned that they have a very good destroyer player, most likely a super Unicum destroyer player, so I know exactly what is RPFing me right now. And based on the location of my teammates, I can guess that the DD is somewhere on the E line. Most likely, even scouting in front of that Kurfürst possibly. So it's very dangerous for me right now, and I'm playing very safe and holding my smoke and just trying to see, will I get spotted? If I get spotted, I know how far he's pushing, and it gives me an idea. The Kurfürst pops up, he was exactly where we suspected, and now I'm pinging around where I suspect this destroyer to be. I'm honestly just waiting for the detection, and there it is, I get detected, and I instantly start turning away. Now I know exactly where this gearing is. That's basically using his RPF against him to get an idea. It's kind of amusing in this sense. If he hadn't been using RPF, I might have smoked up and started shooting, and then I might have gotten either torped, well, we do have hydro, or just spotted in the smoke and killed. So pay attention to that small located sign, because it can give you a lot of useful information. I instantly back off, of course, because you cannot open water gunboat, especially against battleships in the Neptune. It's too squishy for that. You get Urmatch, you get Citadel, there's too many dangers involved, and with a Des Moines this close and only me fighting him really, I'm waiting for my team to get around into our base. I'm spotted again, and now I'm pinging, I'm writing in chat, there's a gearing here, and I wrote to the Benson. Benson, come scout. Please come scout the gearing. We need some sort of information. Luckily, we have a Missouri that's pushing into the cap, so the Missouri will be able to radar him at some point. The Kurfürst turned away, so at this point, I can actually push myself as well. The Des Moines AP you can bounce, but Battleship and Henry and larger, basically battle cruisers, you cannot. But the Des Moines AP you can bounce if you just go nose in. So that's why I have no issues turning in and basically chasing down this gearing. At this point, I'm of course hoping that the Missouri will radar and will get vision of him. But since I'm spotted anyway, there's really no reason for me to not be shooting. If the Kurfürst was still around, I'd be a lot more careful, but because he's turned away, we can actually do a bit of open water gunboating, which is quite risky. Now, the AP power on the ship is great. The range is 16.5, which is decent. I mean, it's Ibuki's stock range, or Ibuki's normal range. The likes of Rune and St. Louis, they have closer to 18 km, both of them. And Alaska has like 19, Kronstadt has 18.2, so it's not something super special. But I mean, you beat the Buffalo and you beat the Seattle, which are more of a HE focused anyway. Ultimately though, the range is pretty decent. 16.5, you don't really need to build for range, you can just build for that raw DPM, aka use the reload booster. Trying to put as much damage on this Des Moines now that he's caught fairly broadside. Remember of course that the Royal Navy AP does have the improved penetration angles. You got that 60 to 75 degrees ricochet angle, which means that you can easily score pens from angles that others would get bounces. Of course you have no HE in return. Being very careful to make sure that I bounce his AP. I also, of course, pop Hydro, since we knew that the DD was here and I was spotted by the DD, so there was a risk that he would just be torping me. So that's why we popped the early Hydro to make sure we're not teething any torps as we chase them down. Now something pretty important happens. First of all, we're getting pretty damn close to the Kurfürst. And more importantly, if we look at the minimap, you can see that there's a buffalo on my left flank and there's a Musashi on my left flank. You can see there, we're just about to come around the island where we would get crossfired. If you're going to push, or if you're going to open water gunboat in this thing, never ever push into a crossfire. That's instant death. Too large of a citadel, too easy to delete. So what I do is I simply stop shooting to get undetected. I drop the torps into the gearing smoke, and I'm turning away to just disengage. I do not want to get caught in this crossfire. You can already see the buffalo was gearing up for it, and deeper I would have pushed, the more likely I would have gotten devastated. So something you need to keep track of. The buffalo is going for the shots, but he had HE loaded. I was already turning away though, so but of course buffalo with his improved pen angles could also potentially have citadel me if his aim had been correct there. But I managed to dodge it by turning sharper, and at this point I'm making sure I'm angled towards the Kurfürst while I'm trading with this buffalo. Once again, we're in a position where we can't really be crossfired, and that's something you need to always try to focus on. The AP DPM on this ship, as I mentioned though, is very good. Your AP DPM is 461k, which is kind of across the board double what many of the other cruisers have. You lack complete HE in return, but if you do get access to those broadsides, you can deal a lot of raw damage. So that is your bread and butter way of farming damage and experience. Note that I stopped pushing that angle because I was about to go into the crossfire of the Musashi, and the Musashi is another ship we don't want anything to do with. Battleships in general are very scary for a Neptune. So we're playing it safe. We're playing a safe positional play. My Benson is pushing fairly aggressive. My Missouri is also pushing. The fact that my Missouri chooses to push now means that I'm also going to turn around and push with him, because of course ideally you want to support your team. You don't want to be in the front, especially if you're pushing into DDs, but if you have a DD in front of you like I do here, then you can more than happily push. You just gotta keep track of your broadsides. In this case, I'm making sure that the island on my left is keeping me zoned away from that Musashi on my left broadside. Also, I'm keeping track of that priority target number. If the number suddenly starts climbing, then we need to be a lot more careful. The Neptune is fundamentally a difficult cruiser to play. That's really what it comes down to. It doesn't enjoy the great concealment of the Minotaur or even the earlier Royal Navy cruisers. It doesn't enjoy the low citadel of the earlier Royal Navy cruisers. It doesn't even enjoy the great smoke firing penalty of the early ones. So you're trading a lot of things to get it. Another thing also worth mentioning is because I played this game on Tech 3 Thursday, my captain is only a 14-point captain. Usually when I tend to, if I play some ships these days, oh, there we go, I got shot from behind, even though I was very angled towards those ships that were shooting me from behind. The Kurfürst, I think turrets just overmatched my stern, or yeah, I think they just overmatched me looking at the angle. It could have been too much broadside as well, but that's the kind of punishment you eat instantly. The slightest bit of mistake, the slightest bit of not dodging, and you get chunked hard. And that's why it's considered a very frustrating experience. Regardless though, it does have its strengths. The strengths is the ability to recover at least from that damage taken. If you build for smokes, as I've done here, basically I have the increased smoke size, and of course I got jack of all trades as well. Then you got fairly fast reloading smokes, and if you allow the smokes to bloom and make enough space, you actually have a lot of space to maneuver in. You notice that I'm constantly moving in the smoke. That's also something I highly highlight or highly encourage, and that's because good players will blind fire into your smokes. So keeping that in mind and seeing that this guy just blacked me quite hard, I'm constantly trying to move. And that's why I don't like when people stop entirely when they smoke up. You want to keep moving slightly. You want to expand, make that smoke large enough that you can maneuver a bit around it. His guns are no longer aimed at me, so I'm not worried about sitting stationary now. But now the guns are pointed at me again, so we're going to be a bit more careful. Also, the Benson got killed by torps, so we activate Hydro. We know they're gearing torps, so they have a lot of range. So I'm also keeping an eye on these torps because it will tell me how far away the gearing was when he launched them. And seeing as they faded already, well, it could be 10 km torps to be fair. So we're just going to play it safe and we're going to disengage from that fight because I no longer have my scout. That Benson that was in front of me, he was the guy who was giving me all that information. He was the guy who was making sure the gearing didn't just sail up and spot me in my smoke. He was my kind of my anchor on that side. And he parked, well, broadside in the smoke to shoot the Kurfürst, and of course the gearing. As I mentioned, a good player will instantly torp him in the smoke because that's such a juicy free target. So instead of picking a fight that is so heavily skewed against us, I'm gonna move to the flank and see if I can support my Cleveland against this Musashi. And this here is another reason why I chose to include this clip, because, well, my idea here is that the Cleveland, he's either gonna start kiting away towards our spawn, or alternatively he can sail towards me and I can smoke him up and we can both sit in our smoke to shoot. Those were the two plans I had in my mind when I launched those torps to support him against the incoming Musashi. However, his plan was actually, as you can see, he started turning in and I had to warn him, I had to ping him, I had to basically use everything in my power to make sure that I don't accidentally torpedo him. His plan was actually to sail around the island and I guess try to kite around the island like that. And he could probably maybe if I hadn't warned him, he might have even been able to sail past my torps and he never would have eaten them. But ultimately though, that was my fault for zoning him away from his initial plan. That's really what it comes down to. I often say that you shouldn't launch torps from the backline, and even here, when I have the best of intentions, the best of plans, and my goal is actually to help the Cleveland, not actually to harm him in any way, I still end up unintentionally disrupting his plan. And that's because you can never know when you launch your torps. You can never know what plan the guy in front of you has. Everyone can make that mistake. And that's why these backline torps are always so sketchy. Even though I didn't hit him with them, I still made him go towards it, make a decision that he probably wasn't even planning to do, or make a plan that he never even intended to execute, and he had to just kite away. Now he shot a bit too much AP instead of HE when I got a broken engine and such things, but that's just details. Ultimately though, even no matter how good you are, launching torps from the backline, regardless of how good and pure and great your plans are, you can still absolutely screw with your teammate. And that's why another reason why I thought this was such a good commentary, because even though I didn't kill him or anything with the torps, I still majorly disrupted his movement, which is why you never really want to launch torps from the backline. I do launch single target torps as a follow-up as the Musashi tries to push nose in. That is of course one of the great strengths of this Royal Navy cruiser, is the ability to either go for the narrow or the single target spreads, and it's so strong against battleships trying to do that kind of shenanigans. But I thought that was a great example because people think that if you launch from the backline, as long as you're not killing someone, it's perfectly fine. Hey, I didn't hit him, what's the big deal? No, you gotta take into account the zoning potential of your torpedoes. And because I never considered the idea of him turning behind the island, I never considered the danger of zoning him away from it by launching the torps the way I did. So take it as a warning, as an example of even the best laid plans, or even like the purest intentions, can absolutely screw with your teammate. And obviously the only one to blame there was me. That was my misplay, and learn from the example, so to say. Anyway, at this point I'm trying to hunt down the Zipper. The game is about to end. I'm trying to get some additional damage in before this game does end, but it looks like I will not have the chance to do so because he decides to park behind an island. Still though, looking at the scoreboard, I'm very satisfied. This was brutal matchmaking, this was a brutal map, they had some very experienced players on their team like that gearing, so it was gonna be a very hard game, and the fact that I managed to squeeze out the 223k damage out of it makes me very happy, because the Neptune is usually, it can tend to be a struggle to get these solid games out of. Looking at the team score, we got all 2.1k base XP, which is pretty good. The problem, of course, with playing the standard battles instead of domination is that you get less opportunities to shoot destroyers, because there's no convenient capture points that get radared or spotted, or DDs bump into each other in the cap zones when you have the guns pointed that way, and like it's harder to be as effective against destroyers, not to mention there were so few DDs this game. Also, you can't get any cap resets and you don't really get any capture XP either, so on average standard battles have significantly less base XP handed out. Detailed report, the bread and butter was of course the guns, the 7 torps we landed, I think every single one of them was on the Musashi. In general, if you are rarely in too many situations where you can use them. Don't get me wrong, the torps are great, but usually when you're torping a smoked up destroyer, or you're torping someone pushing around a corner or pushing into you, as we see there. The YOLO moves, they can work. Don't get me wrong, YOLOs can work simply because you have such strong torps and so many of them. But you got to remember, you're still an extremely squishy cruiser, and the amount of times I had some Neptune or Minotaur or whatever decide, haha, I'm gonna YOLO him, and then I just press the fire button and my AP overmatches him and deletes him with multiple citadels. Like, that happens so very often. So, something to keep in mind. Regardless, let me show you guys my recommended build for this ship. Right, as usual, I will start with the modules. And honestly, on the Neptune, I would probably go for the range first. 15 km range against tier 10s with your smoke firing penalty being what it is. I don't like it. Get the range upgrade, it gives you 1.5 km extra, which can be extremely useful, especially when you get maps that are highly unfavorable. Follow that instantly up by getting the hull upgrade. The hull upgrade gives you a nice chunk of health, it gives you maneuverability and some AA, all of which are quite useful, especially since the Neptune, the fully upgraded Neptune, if you spec for manual AA and things, you tend to get really absurd AA values, but that requires a more specified captain usually. Finally, the torpedo upgrade, raw damage, and probably flooding chance. The game doesn't really show us, but usually when there's upgrades like this, it also increases the flooding chance. The upgrade is pretty minimal though. It's a 1.2k per torpedo upgrade, so if you just want to get to the Minotaur as soon as possible, the option of skipping the torpedo upgrade is absolutely there. Consumable wise, start by getting, I would say, probably damage con is always your bread and butter, followed up by getting the smoke. The improved smoke. Radar Neptune is really sketchy because you don't quite have the same type of survivability or concealment that you have in the Minotaur. So Radar Neptune I consider quite sketchy. Playing it safe with the smoke is usually the better choice, especially since you have that great range and you have those better ballistics than you have at higher tier. Follow that up with improved heal and improved hydro in that order. Upgrade wise, turret torpedo tube survival, keeping your steering gears alive, increased AA range, faster rudder shift, concealment, and faster reload. There are really no other upgrades I would go for here. Nothing is really worth it. I've seen some people go for range, but honestly no. 16.5 is enough. You got a 10 km buffer with your smoke that you can use. Just position somewhat wisely and you should be absolutely fine with that range and that reload. Captain perks wise, once again, this is the captain I used for Tech Tree Thursday. So first order of priority is priority target, adrenaline rush, superintendent, and concealment expert. That I would say is the bread and butter. Now, especially since I have a Dunkirk captain, aka Jack Dunkirk or Bert Dunkirk, they are both special captains. I like using the expanded smoke area as well as the faster jack of all trades, because this gives you this combined with the faster reloading consumables flag gives you a very fast reloading smoke, and it has some great synergy going there. Ultimately, if you want to be aiming for the final Minotaur captain, so to say, I'm not using a Dunkirk captain on my Minotaur because I don't play it enough, but ultimately the build remains the same. The only thing I spec afterwards is AFT. Manual AA is an option as well. I like the AFT increased range and preventive maintenance. That's where I'd put the last 5 points. So the captain that I recommend on the Neptune does absolutely transfer over to the Minotaur quite comfortably. Flag wise, number one should be heal. You have a fantastic heal. Buffing it by 20% is 20% more fantastic. Faster consumables, absolutely. Detonation flag, I mostly ran it because of it was example games and I didn't want to detonate when making an example game. Your AA is fantastic. Buffing it by 10%, why the hell not? It's a nice extra bonus. Other than that, it's kind of up to you. Speed is questionable, considering you don't really gunboat in the open too much. You don't really chase and so forth, so it's mostly used for disengaging. The 5% faster disengage might be useful, but a bit questionable on the ship since you spend so much time moving at slow speeds in your own smoke. So mostly economic flags at this point. Anyway, that was my Neptune commentary and example gameplay. I hope you guys enjoyed it, and I will talk to you guys later.